At 63, the tragedy of Jordan Peterson is beyond heartbreaking. Health updates. At 63 years old, the story of Jordan Peterson feels less like the rise of a public intellectual and more like a quiet, unfolding tragedy that few people fully understand. To millions, he was the sharp voice cutting through cultural chaos. To others, he was a controversial figure who sparked endless debates. But behind the lectures, the best-selling books, and the roaring crowds, there was always a man fighting battles that the world could not see. Jordan Burt Peterson was born on June 12, 1962, in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and raised in the small northern town of Fairview. It was a quiet place, surrounded by endless prairie skies and long winters that seemed to stretch forever. His father worked as a schoolteacher, and his mother was a librarian. Books filled the home. Ideas were encouraged. Curiosity was not just allowed, it was expected. From a young age, Peterson was different. He wasn't the loudest kid in the room, but he was always thinking, always questioning. While other children were playing outside, he often found himself buried in books, fascinated by philosophy, psychology, and the strange darkness of human nature. Why do people suffer? Why do civilizations collapse? Why do ordinary people sometimes do terrible things? Those questions would shape the rest of his life. Years later, Peterson would study political science and psychology, eventually earning his PhD in clinical psychology. His mind was razor-sharp, his curiosity endless. When he began teaching at Harvard University in the 1990s, students quickly realized they were witnessing something unusual. His lectures weren't ordinary lessons. They were intense explorations of history, mythology, religion, and the human psyche. Students packed lecture halls just to hear him speak. Later, when he returned to Canada to teach at the University of Toronto, something unexpected happened. His lectures began appearing online. Millions of people around the world discovered him through long-form talks that lasted hours. He spoke about responsibility, about meaning, about the danger of chaos and the importance of order. For many young people who felt lost, Peterson's words hit like lightning. But the same qualities that made him powerful also made him vulnerable. Peterson carried the weight of the world's suffering in his mind. He studied the worst parts of human history, the Holocaust, totalitarian regimes, genocide, and the fragile psychology that allows such horrors to happen. He often said that if you stare long enough into the darkness of humanity, you begin to see something uncomfortable, the potential for that darkness inside yourself. What does it do to a person to spend decades studying the darkest chapters of human history? What happens when someone spends their entire life trying to understand suffering? For years, Peterson appeared unstoppable. His book, 12 Rules for Life, became a global bestseller. He traveled across continents, giving lectures that filled theaters with thousands of people. His words were translated into dozens of languages. Some saw him as a mentor. Others saw him as an enemy. But either way, the world was watching. And then, suddenly, everything changed. Behind the scenes, Peterson's family was facing a devastating crisis. His wife Tammy was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. The diagnosis hit like a thunderclap. Peterson, who had spent his career analyzing human suffering in theory, was now staring at it in his own home. Fear, uncertainty, sleepless nights. Around this time, Peterson was prescribed medication to deal with the overwhelming anxiety and stress that had begun consuming him. What followed would become one of the most painful chapters of his life. The medication triggered a severe dependency and an intense neurological reaction that few people around him could fully understand. His health collapsed. Suddenly, the man who had once spoken for hours without notes, the professor who could command an audience of thousands, could barely function. His family described months of confusion, physical pain, and terrifying medical complications. Hospitals, treatments, travel across countries searching for help. At one point, Peterson disappeared from public life entirely. For someone who had become one of the most visible thinkers in the world, the silence was deafening. Rumors spread online. Some people assumed he had simply vanished. Others wondered if he would ever return at all. But the real story was far more human and far more heartbreaking. Recovery, as it turned out, was not quick. It was not easy. Peterson later described months of extreme suffering, neurological symptoms, physical weakness, and the terrifying realization that the mind he had relied on his entire life no longer worked the way it once had. Imagine spending decades building your identity around your intellect, your voice, your ability to think and articulate complex ideas. And then suddenly, that ability begins slipping away. Who are you when the thing that defined you disappears? Slowly, painfully, Peterson began to recover. His family stood beside him through every moment of uncertainty. His daughter spoke publicly about the long road back. Step by step, he returned to writing, speaking, and appearing again in public conversations. But those who listened closely noticed something different now. There is a quiet heaviness in his voice. The man who once analyzed suffering from a distance now speaks as someone who has walked directly through it. And that raises a deeper question. Was this downfall simply the result of illness and circumstance, or was it the inevitable cost of a man who spent his entire life staring into humanity's darkest truths? At 63 years old, Jordan Peterson remains a deeply polarizing figure. Some still admire him, others still criticize him. But beyond the debates and headlines lies something far more universal, the fragile reality that even the strongest minds can break under the weight of life's storms. Because in the end, perhaps the most haunting part of this story isn't the controversy or the fame or even the suffering. It's the reminder that behind every public figure we argue about online, there is still a human being, a father, a husband, a man who once asked the world why people suffer and eventually had to face that question himself. And maybe the real mystery isn't what happened to Jordan Peterson. Maybe the real question is this. When life forces us into our darkest moments, how many of us truly find a way back?